So that's the science. Now we have an understanding of how sound behaves when it's working in space, but we need to sort of understand that by hearing some sound as well. It's going to give us a much better sense of what happens when we take an instrument and place it in a different space in the soundstage. And we can do that really nicely using Damage 2. So what I've done here is to program a very basic solo tom part. And what I've done is to bring that sound to the front of the virtual space. Now what that means is we're now imagining that this solo tom player is right on the edge of the stage, right in front of us. And what that means is that most of the sound we're going to hear is going to be direct signal, not reverberation, but just direct dry sound. We're going to hear a little bit of reverb, but not so much. And then what we're going to have a chance to do is to move this sound around the space. And it stands to reason that the further back we make our tom player go, the more reverb is going to become part of the signal that we're hearing. We're going to hear less dry sound and more reverb. Let's hear that now. So what happens when we move this little dot, this dot representing this player, is that we get a chance to experience what happens when we move a sound from front to back. Now, when we work with electronic sounds, we tend not to think about the sound stage in which we're working. If we were programming sort of orchestral music, we'd think about that a lot. We'd think about where the string players would play and the wind players and the brass players and the percussion players, because you can't fit an orchestra onto the very front of a stage. They have to be spread out. And so effectively, what we were trying to do would be to sort of produce the sound of an orchestra using software plugins, we'd have to sort of think about where those players were going to sit on the stage. If we're working with electronic sound sources, we can bring everything to the front, but by doing that, we're really missing out on an opportunity to think about reverb and where we want each sound to come from. And what we can hear is this amazing sort of balance that comes when we start moving players around and we start experimenting with the difference between a direct signal and a wet signal. So when we're actually working with sound, what we have a chance to do with reverb is to approximate what we've just done with this virtual space. In lots of plugins, we don't get a sound stage like this that allows us to move a sound around in a space. So how can we do that with a plugin? Well, let's bring our tom player back to the front for a moment. And what we'll do instead of using the actual Damage 2 interface is we'll close that down for a moment. And instead what I'm going to do is just to bring in Logic's Chromaverb. Now this behaves a lot like lots of algorithmic plugins. It's going to begin to give us a sense of what we can do when we start to bring in reverb to a sound. And crucially, what we're going to do is to start in the bottom right-hand corner and look at the difference between the dry signal, the source sound, and the wet signal, which is just the reverb. So at the moment when I press play, we're going to hear our dry tom player, just like before, right on the front of the edge of the stage with no reverb, just where we started out a moment ago. Now we can see the kind of clouds of frequency information that exists within this sound. Lots of the bass, some in the middle, and a little bit up at the top as well, but we're not hearing any reverb. The reverb is over here on its own little fader. This effectively is our wet signal. This is just the reverb. So what I can start to do is to tease in a sense of the space in which this player is playing by just increasing the wet level over here. Now, the reverb that we're hearing is effectively made from the parameters over here, which we're going to explore in more depth shortly. What these allow us to do is to control things like the density of the reverb, how long it lasts, how far we are away from the source sound, and changing any of those parameters will of course have an effect on the sound. But for now, we're just learning about these two really important elements, the dry original source and the wet source. So effectively the difference between the original sound and just the reverb. And crucially, what most algorithmic reverbs will allow you to do is to hear just the reverb by itself. If I turn the dry sound down and I turn the wet signal up, this is just reverb. So effectively it's like a sort of ghost signal which has been created in a space, and all we can hear is the reverb portion of the sound. Now that often doesn't work within the context of mixes. What we want is the sound and some reverb behind it. But what we've crucially learnt here is the difference between dry and wet signals, and the fact that lots of algorithmic reverbs give us a chance to blend those on separate dials. If your algorithmic reverb has a mixed dial, it sets a balance between the two things. 0 is just dry and 100% is just wet. So by setting a mixed dial between those 2 points, you're setting a sort of crossfade balance between the original signal and the wet signal.